welcome to the Evening Review. My name is Sukhana Klache, and joining us from Nairobi, Kenya, is founder of Brands on a Mission, Professor Myriam Sidibe. Welcome to the Evening Review, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight.
I just want to know, since our conversation is on sexual reproductive health and rights, can you tell us more about the Brands on a Mission Pan-African campaign?
Yes, of course. So I'm the founder and chief mission officer of Brands on a Mission. Brands on a Mission is a consulting. It's a B Corp, a purpose consulting that helps brands and companies across the world accelerate their impact on their social impact, mainly on health and well-being. And what we've done is we've launched a campaign called African Voices. It's a Pan-African campaign that's looking at initiating and elevating the conversations around sexual reproductive rights across the continent. And we're starting with 3 countries. We're starting with Namibia, Niger, and Cape Verde. And we had a first initial trip in Namibia last week.
Okay. And then following your trip to Namibia, what were your impressions in terms of the campaign and how people are reacting to it?
I think so. The idea for coming to Namibia was to be a fact-finding mission, to understand a bit what currently is going on, but also to identify and support local grassroots movement that we might be able to bring to the forefront of the continent, and also come up with human stories that we will be able to highlight in this one-year advocacy project that we have across the continent. Now, the conversation also is around eventually creating a multi-stakeholder platform that will bring many different actors around sexual reproductive rights and try to accelerate the debate around equity, around making sure that inclusion, everybody has access to rights and services, and then really thinking about some of the very important conversations around teenage pregnancies across the continent, right? What exactly are we doing in terms of maternal mortality and linked to reproductive issues, for example? What are we doing in terms of sex education, if at all, in our schools and as well? What exactly needs to happen in terms of sexual transmitted disease and infections across the continent? What are we doing in terms of gender-based violence? We know that so many women are suffering from violence, mainly from an intimate partner perspective. What are we doing in terms of the rights of minorities, such as the LGBTQ, for example? What are we doing in terms of, changing, for example, or reviewing the Sterilization and Abortion Act that has been handed over to us, since apartheid time in 1975, in Namibia? So those are all conversations around, trying to get our women and our girls to have access to safer services, more rights and opportunities for a healthier life throughout her life. I guess that's one of the things that we've been looking at in starting with Namibia. I'm happy to give you a couple of anecdotes and stories that I've met. So we had an amazing meeting with, obviously, your First Lady, champion on SRHR through her foundation on one economy foundation, and then the Be Free movement that's for adolescents. We went to visit students at NANSO, for example, to understand what exactly are their perspectives in terms of sexual reproductive rights and the issues that they're really thinking about. And what you'd be surprised and happy to hear that thinking about giving every school child, for example, a school pads is something that they're really thinking about, wondering why is it that we're giving condoms, but we're not giving pads to young girls going to school that are still stigmatized in terms of menstrual health, for example. We had conversations on reproductive justice, really thinking about, what happens in terms of rights of, bodily autonomy, really thinking about, conversations ranging from what is consent to all the way to, is there rape in the case of marriage, for example, and thinking about the rights of a woman, that a woman's body belongs first to her. So very interesting conversations. We also heard some really bad stories and sad stories about an 11-year-old giving birth next week, for example, in Namibia. And thinking, still in a country that boasts its status of middle income country, how can that be possible? How can we allow a child to lose completely her innocence to that extent, and probably most of her opportunities of what she'll be able to get and do because of not us failing her in terms of her status. Yeah.
And then last week, there were engagements on the issue of whether the abortion should be legalized vis-a-vis leaving it criminalized. Your participation in these discussions, what is your view in terms of the situation in Namibia?
Well, I keep thinking about this 11-year-old that is giving birth in a couple of weeks. I keep thinking about the woman that's having no choice but to, carry a pregnancy with a child, for example, who, a fetus that will not live because it's already, it will not live beyond birth. And I keep thinking about the trauma that we're inducing to some of these young women and girls across the continent. And I keep thinking about, women that are still dying in childbirth because, they were way too young or young to be able to have a baby or at this point. And I keep thinking that there must be a better way to be able to, one, prevent all these unwanted pregnancies or unplanned pregnancies. And there must be a way to give more choices out there. And that, the Namibia of 1975 isn't the Namibia of 2023. And that if you look at, this, an act that was basically handed over to us from apartheid time may not be one that we may want to abide to in this continent anymore. So that's basically where I stand by, that I think it's time to review. It's time to rethink how do we give more control to women and their reproductive rights, because a woman that is fully in control of her reproductive rights is probably a woman that is a better partner, that's a better wife, that's a better daughter, that's a better employee. So all around, better for society as well.
And then, excuse me, the African Voices Project that plans to advocate for expanded sexual and reproductive rights and services in sub-Saharan Africa. How do you plan to advocate for these rights?
At the moment, it's just to come up with stories and pick out human stories and partners whose voice we need to elevate in this conversation. It's only a one-year advocacy project, but I'm hoping that we will be able to expand beyond that and create a multi-stakeholder platform across Africa and take more of these stories. But we're seeing some trends already. We're looking at, teenage pregnancies. We're looking at the second decade of life as, of this young girl from 10 to 19 that, is either menstruating for the first time, is being exposed to drugs, as having mental health issues, might have already conversations around a rape, not well informed. And then I think about, everything that we should do. The young girl that needs to be vaccinated on HPV to avoid cervical cancer later on in life. When you think that 19 out of the 20 countries that suffer from cervical cancer, a burden is mainly in Africa. So I think there is so much to be done and so much that we need to do in terms of raising the profile of sexual reproductive health rights and services, and that I believe that all of us have a role to play. And my role here, obviously, is, having done most of my public health career in the private sector, is to think about how you don't forget the private sector as part of those conversations. How do we bring influencers? How do we bring, radical feminists? How do we bring, obviously church-based association as well? And we think about faith-based association to really get into all those conversations and understand what can we do so that we don't, we minimize the negative impact that would happen from a society that has not put forward sexual reproductive rights at the forefront.
I'd like to continue the conversation with you, but we'll have to go for a short commercial break. So please do stay tuned in.
Okay.
Welcome to My.NA Cars, your ultimate destination for everything automotive.
I am your host, Diana Master.
Teamwork makes the dream work, right?
Discover the latest models, innovative technologies, and expert insights from our passionate hosts. Learn essential maintenance tips and get exclusive behind-the-scenes access to the automotive industry. Don't miss My.NA Cars on NTV every Thursday at 2100 hours. Tune in and ignite your passion for automobiles.
Welcome back. Professor, what is the role of Brands on a Mission in the campaign for sexual reproductive health rights in Africa? And what have been the achievements so far? Hello, Professor, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm still on mute. Namibia was our first trip, and we just started the project. So this is our first couple of weeks, if days into the project. The idea is very simple: is that Brands on a Mission would catalyze, actors and bring out stories at the heart of the conversation. To think about what can one do to really bring the profile and elevate the profile around sexual reproductive rights. So we host the project. We'll go around these 3 countries. We'll try to see whether from francophone to anglophone to lusophone, whether there are trends that are coming across and what opportunities there will be to be able to operate in less silos. Because even if you look at some of the actors that are playing, some of them, everybody's working on different angle, on the conversation. And I think what we're trying to do is to see whether there would be a holistic solution that brings about the best of those resources from all the partners across solutions on top of that. But for this year, it's only an advocacy project. It's about making sure that we are in the media. It's making sure that we bring out the right stories. It's making sure that we communicate and we identify local groups and local supports, local movements that we might want to support. That is what the first year's project is about. And Brands on a Mission hosts this project and runs this project.
Professor, the African continent is quite large, as you've just alluded to, and there's obviously huge differences in cultures and perceptions. Do you see this as a noticeable concern going forward as part of the advocacy project?
Absolutely. I don't think a solution that fits in Namibia is a solution that would necessarily fit to DRC, right? Or Kenya for that matter. I think the laws are different, but there are some tendencies. I mean, I think focusing on the second decade of life or the teenage girl is going to be absolutely critical. And I think we may want to think of strategies to make sure that we are speaking to her in the right voice, that we are empowering her, and we're also giving her not only the agency but also the skills to be able to respond and take control of what needs to happen. I do think that the continent, we have a very young continent, right? So, and that is one thing that is absolutely, the same in almost every other country. So strategies that are going to be at the forefront around youth, adolescent health are going to be absolutely critical. So we know that, for example. So, and what we've learned in terms of demand, for example, for HPV vaccine, or what we've learned in terms of taboos around safe sex, or what we've learned around sexually transmitted disease. I mean, some of those could be replicable from one country to the other. So the idea here is to identify the myths and taboos, to think of solutions in terms of services delivery, to think about influencers and voices that need to be brought to the table so that we can catalyze and mobilize more resources around this topic of sexual reproductive health, which is what we're talking about today.
Professor, for the Southern African region, we have the Southern African Development Community, which looks at policy interventions within the region. Organs such as these, how important do you think their participation is in driving the issue of sexual reproductive health?
I do think that everybody should be. This is probably the most important and issue that all of us should be driving. So sexual reproductive rights is the business of everyone, right? So I don't think it's limited to one entity, for example. And I do think that from media, from catalyzer, from businesses, from influencers, from, all of them need to be thinking about what we should be talking about in terms of sexual reproductive rights and services, right? And from, keeping your employee happy to making sure that, you are keeping them alive and thriving. I think all that is part of the conversation that we need to have and we need to drive. And I do believe that the more we align as Africans, we'll have an African story that is not driven by a Western narrative, but that is one that we can own and that we therefore can drive by ourselves.
In your conversations with policymakers, with advocacy groups and the like, do you see any resistance to this issue, or do you believe that there's political and social will that it's gaining traction to give attention to this issue?
I think that it's difficult. I mean, I've seen, like when I was just in Namibia right now, I've seen all the public hearings that are currently happening around abortion. I think there's still a lot of skepticism about how transparent they will be and what's the best way to bring this back to the parliament. Because I think at the end, sexual reproductive rights has been very much linked to values, not enough around, I guess, a pleasure-based perspective, right? Or thinking about what is right for the woman and what exactly she needs or aspires to. So I think very often it becomes politicized. And at the heart of the conversations, we forget that there is a woman there that is trying to live a happy, fulfilled life, right? And making sure that she's the best mother, the best daughter, the best member of society that she can be. And for that, she needs to be in control of her sexual reproductive life. And I think that is the starting conversation that we need to have and think in this conversation.
And then, Professor, in your experiences and going across the continent where you have been, are there examples that Namibia can cite that is at least making inroads into this matter?
Yeah, there's many interesting things happening around the continent, from Kenya passing the bill around every single schoolgirl will not have to pay for a pads, for example. I think that's something that's quite interesting, that I think the continent, that Namibia could pick up on, for example. I think there's lots of very interesting conversation around the space of menstrual health, of like destigmatizing it, for example. That's something that's really interesting. I think thinking about distribution, obviously, of those pads in school and thinking about where you are. I think there's a lot of very interesting things that brands are doing also, right? That on the continent, for example, on creating maybe pads and that are either recyclable, that or the cup, for example, or underwear panties that we could really think to adopt for a young girl in school. So there's very interesting conversations around demands for HPV vaccines and thinking about how you reduce the load on cervical cancer. All those are very interesting, case studies and stories that one could probably share with Namibia, and think about how the government is maybe asking for more HPV vaccine and a better coverage, for example, of it.
And then, Prof, following your visit to Namibia, what would you highlight as some of the interventions that you think Namibia is at least making some inroads into?
Maternal mortality is a big one. I think Namibia has done huge progress on maternal mortality. It's reduced maternal mortality rates by a quarter, or I think even by a fourth. So I think that is a huge thing that has been achieved, and obviously access to contraception is another one that's actually was very impressive. So we saw many implants and being given for free and to young university students, and all that is quite interesting. I did think that the conversation was rather open, especially around the youth, in terms of what they're wanting, what they would like. So influencers, young content creators, there was a lot of very interesting conversations that are driving, changing the narrative on this continent, which I think Namibia needs to keep upholding and really thinking about where you are. We met some amazing people. I met your Minister of Justice, Ivan Dausab. I met your ex-Minister of Health, Bernard Fiku. We met, obviously, your First Lady, the people from NAPA, the people from VCRC, thought leader on reproductive justice. So quite a lot of very interesting actors and programs and models are actually happening out of Namibia.
And then your learnings or your experience in Namibia, how will it help in shaping you for the rest of, as you go into the campaign in the countries that you mentioned at the start of the interview?
I think what we will do is identify some of the stories that really appeal to us, and then start putting names and start collating and narrating them in a way that will be of interest to the media, both across the continent and globally. I think because it's the first country and we were so well received and we had such high-profile conversations and discussions, what we'd like to do is model the rest of the conversation around the rest of the trips around the trip from Namibia, and also to start seeing how political will and civil society and media can work together better to be able to bring this conversation at the heart of it all.
And then, Professor, your biggest appeal to policymakers, to private sector, to the media, to civic organizations, what is the big message or what is the big plea that you have in addressing this sensitive issue?
I think the conversation that is that I'd like to do again, and then would like to leave you with, is the fact that a woman and a girl that is in control of her sexual reproductive rights is a better wife, is a better partner, is a better mother, is a better employee, is a better member of society. And I think all of our voices need to gather around this conversation, so that we can empower her to be able to have this control. And I'd love to be able to have these conversations and all our voices together, including yourselves. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen.
And then lastly, Professor, when I know you've just recently visited Namibia, when can we expect you to visit again, and how keen are you to come back and have extended conversations on this matter?
I'm very keen. This is it's a wonderful country. I was so well received. I'm very excited to figure out how we can create a coalition that is inclusive of all the partners that I've met. I'd like to be back in the next couple of weeks or months. I mean, we need to figure out how we collate some of these questions and some of these human stories and bring forward some of the front and forward-looking conversations that I've had in Namibia, as well as really push the needles on some of the issues that are still controversial and a bit difficult to tackle.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That wraps up the evening review. Good night.